There are people who learn to love too early, people who, before even knowing what affection was, were already offering comfort. Before understanding what care meant, they were already taking care of others. And as beautiful as that may seem to the world, there is a very lonely kind of pain behind this constant giving, because no one is born knowing how to love. We learn through what we receive. But when what one receives is absence, pressure, or coldness, the love that is born from that comes stitched together, unbalanced. It comes from urgency, not choice. These people don't love because they want to. They love because they need to, because somehow they believe that only by loving will they have any value. And the world applauds. It calls them altruistic, generous-hearted, enlightened souls. But no one asks what that person does with their own pain when the house is silent and the phone doesn't ring, when they need comfort and don't know who to turn to, when they cry quietly in the shower because they don't want to bother anyone. Because for someone who only learned to give, asking for affection feels almost like betrayal. It feels like weakness. It feels shameful. It feels selfish. So they pretend everything is fine, even when it's not. They offer support, even as they fall apart. They hug, even with tired arms. They smile, even with a shattered heart. And the cruelest part is that over time they start to believe they truly don't need anything. That they were born to be a support, not to be supported. That being truly loved would be a system error, a glitch in the universe. Because how could anyone see beauty in what they hide the most? How could anyone love the broken parts, the fears, the insecurities, the emptiness? They don't believe that. They can't believe it because they've never lived it. Because the world always looked at them as if to say, "You're so strong, you can handle everything." And they believed it. And now, when someone tries to love them for real, when someone tries to offer exactly what they always gave, the discomfort is almost unbearable. It's not that they don't want to receive. They do, deeply, but they're afraid. Afraid they won't know what to do with that love. Afraid to get attached and then lose it. Afraid to trust and then be abandoned. Afraid to relax and then be disappointed. So they step back, they put up an invisible wall, a polite smile, a vague excuse. They say they're busy, that they're fine alone, that they don't need anything. But inside, all they truly want is to be held the way they hold others, to be listened to with the same care they give, to be seen, fully, without masks, and still be loved. The truth is, those who only learn to give are often surrounded by people, yet die of emotional hunger. Because it's no use offering feasts if your own plate is empty. It's no use feeding the world if no one asks whether you've eaten. And this hunger turns into anger, exhaustion, frustration. It builds up in silences, in unexplainable fatigue, in crises no one understands. Until one day, this person explodes, or begs, or simply gives up, and everyone is shocked. But she was so strong. She was, because she had no other choice. That's why, deep down, those who only know how to give also desperately need to learn how to receive without guilt, to receive without needing to justify it, to receive without the feeling that they owe something in return, because love cannot be a debt. Love must be a meeting, and every true meeting begins when someone has the courage to stop serving others and finally sits at the table too. There are people who have been carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders since forever. People who were told from a very young age that they had to be mature, responsible, reliable. People who, even as children, already knew how to read the atmosphere at home, adjust their behavior so as not to bother anyone, hold back their tears so no one would worry. People who understood early on that they could not be a problem, who learned to silence their own pain to protect the emotional stability of others. And when you grow up like this, strength becomes a shield, an emotional armor, a way of existing in the world that looks admirable, but is, in truth, a survival strategy. These people confuse being loved with being useful, with being invincible, with always being the solution and never the source of concern. They internalize a cruel logic. If I show weakness, I'll be discarded. If I become a burden, they'll leave. And so they live trying to prove their worth through strength. They don't rest. They don't ask for help. They don't admit when they're exhausted, because they feel the love they receive is conditional. And the condition is, never need too much, never fail, never fall apart. The problem is, no one can be strong all the time. And when that wall begins to crack, when the body shows signs of fatigue, when the emotional core collapses, despair sets in. because the foundation of the affection in that relationship was performance. And if I'm not functioning, am I still lovable? Am I still enough? Will anyone stay by my side if I'm not smiling, performing, solving everything? This is the moment when loneliness screams the loudest. Because as much as the world has learned to admire that strength, almost no one has learned how to stand beside it when it falls apart. And the strong person, used to protecting everyone else, finds themselves without a net, without comfort, without a safe harbor. Worse, often, when they finally try to show vulnerability, they are met with surprise or discomfort, as if their pain had no place, as if their breakdown were a betrayal of the image others built around them, and so they go back to hiding, to pulling themselves together too quickly, to apologizing for not being okay. And the cycle repeats. I will only be loved if I'm invincible. I will only be accepted if I don't cause trouble. I will only have value if I remain the unshakable rock I've always been. But that is not love. That is a silent contract of self-abandonment, an unfair exchange in which the person gives all they have, time, attention, energy, presence, in return for an acceptance that demands they pretend not to feel pain. True love does not require us to hide our weaknesses. True love welcomes tiredness, mistakes, and the need to vent. True love doesn't demand constant strength. It offers comfort. It allows pauses. It says, you don't have to carry everything alone. I'm here. But to recognize this kind of love, the strong person first needs to believe that they deserve to be loved even on their bad days, even when they are drained, even when they have nothing to give. Because the kind of strength that truly heals is not the one that endures everything in silence. It's the one that, even while trembling, can say, today I need to be cared for too. And that is revolutionary for someone who spent their entire life believing they were only worthy of love when carrying the entire world on their shoulders. It's strange when the thing we dreamed about the most finally happens, and still we can't stay. When the hug comes, but our shoulders tense up. When the compliment arrives, but our automatic response is a self-deprecating joke. When someone looks us in the eyes with tenderness, and we look away, feeling an unexplainable discomfort. It may seem like a contradiction, but it's not. It's defense. It's the body saying, this is dangerous, even when the mind says, this is what I wanted. Because for someone who has spent their whole life loving more than being loved, receiving affection feels like an unfamiliar language, like stepping into a house that's far too beautiful to belong to you. Often, this rejection isn't rational. It happens in the details, a tight jaw, a joke in the middle of an intimate moment, a sudden urge to pull away. Affection arrives, and instead of warming you, it startles you, because it brings with it something you've spent years avoiding. Being seen, and being truly seen is terrifying, because to be seen is to risk being found out, to have your flaws exposed, to show that behind the generosity lies a deep need, that behind the strength lies fragility, that behind the calm there's a tired, insecure heart, longing to be held, and terrified of it at the same time. That fear settles in the body, and the body does not forget. It remembers the times you opened up and weren't received well, the times you cried and were called weak, the times you wanted comfort and were told you were dramatic. The body stores every rejection, every disappointment, every poorly received gesture of love. And when sincere affection finally shows up, it reacts like it's saying, don't trust it. That's why for some people, healthy love doesn't bring pleasure. It brings confusion, sometimes even anger, because it disarms. It breaks a long-standing pattern of emotional vigilance. It shows that maybe, just maybe, you can be loved even without the mask. But accepting affection takes practice, and practice takes time. You have to learn to tolerate the initial discomfort of being cared for. You have to take a deep breath when your first instinct is to run. You have to recognize that discomfort doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something is new, and that this newness, however strange it may feel, could be the start of something deeply healing. Because affection isn't just emotional, it's also physical. It's presence, it's touch, gaze, listening, and your body needs to relearn all of it. At first, you'll probably feel ridiculous when receiving a compliment. You might want to hide your face when someone praises you sincerely. You might think it's too much when someone says they admire you, find you beautiful, important, enough. But keep going, not to please the other person, but to retrain your body not to reject the love it deserves. Because little by little, that discomfort turns into familiarity. Then, it becomes comfort. And then one day you'll realize you're simply there, still now being loved, and for the first time you don't feel like running. And when that happens, you'll understand that the kind of love that used to paralyze you wasn't love. It was neediness, control, an emotional contract. But the love that meets you whole, that sees you without invading, that touches you without suffocating, that is the kind of love worth learning to receive. Even if in the beginning your body doesn't quite know what to do with it, many people spend their lives searching for love without realizing that the way they search already carries a distorted idea of what it means to be loved. Because in childhood, the affection we receive, or don't receive, becomes our reference. It becomes the ruler, the invisible law that will guide every relationship in the future. And if that child grew up in an environment where affection only came after performance, they learned that love must be earned, that only obedient children get comfort, that only those who get good grades receive praise, that only those who don't cause trouble get heard, that only those who get it right get seen. And this lesson, carved deep inside, becomes an absolute truth. Love is not given. Love must be conquered. That's why, as an adult, this person feels guilt just for existing, for being tired, for having needs, for wanting to be cared for, because the love they knew was always conditional, a prize, a currency of exchange. And every time someone offers free affection, without demands, without expectations, without negotiation, something inside them doesn't trust it, rejects it, sabotages it, because it doesn't feel real, because it challenges everything they've always believed about themselves. I only matter if I'm perfect. I'm only lovable when I'm at my best. I can only be cared for if I don't bother anyone. These beliefs settle in the heart and shape even the smallest details of daily life. They are the reason someone apologizes for being sad. They are the reason someone hides their illness to avoid worrying others. They are the reason someone keeps their problems to themselves because they don't want to be a burden. And little by little, this person starts to disappear. They become function only, a listener, a presence for others, because they never learned how to be a presence for themselves. And when finally someone appears who wants to stay, even when they have nothing to offer, the discomfort hits like an avalanche, because no one ever stayed before, because for them, love was always something to give, never something to receive. And the saddest part is that so often this distortion began way too early. It started with impatient glances, with prolonged silences, with enormous expectations. It started when affection became a merit and not a right, when the child was praised for being well-behaved, but ignored when expressing anger, when they got attention for a perfect grade, but were left alone when they were afraid. And without realizing it, they learned that their existence only had value if it came with results, with shine, with exemplary behavior, with usefulness. But love is not emotional salary. It's not a reward. It's not a concession. Real love is what remains even when we're not shining. It's what stays even when we fail, stumble, scream, cry. And for someone who has never experienced that, it's almost impossible to believe it exists. That's why so many people reject this kind of love, because it feels fake, because it feels too good, because it confronts the old pain of having learned that love only came when you were less like yourself. Unlearning this takes time. It requires patience. It means relearning that the simple act of breathing is enough to be worthy of love, that you don't need to be happy all the time to deserve company, that you don't need to be strong all the time to deserve comfort, that you don't need to do anything to justify your existence, that you are worthy of love, exactly as you are, even when you're silent, even when you're afraid, even when you're just being. There is a kind of pain no one sees, because it's always disguised as a virtue. The pain of someone who helps everyone all the time, the pain of someone who becomes indispensable to others, but invisible to themselves, the pain of someone who brings coffee to the meeting, sends birthday messages, listens to late-night venting, and goes to bed without anyone asking how their own day went. This is the most dangerous kind of loneliness, the one that hides behind constant presence, because it's easy to believe that someone who takes care of others is okay, that someone who always listens doesn't need to be heard, that someone who lights the way for others isn't stumbling in their own darkness. But behind so much giving, there's often a hole, an old emptiness, an emotional silence that was never filled. Helping becomes a way to quiet that echo. Every piece of advice, every problem solved, every time this person anticipates someone else's needs is also an unconscious attempt to soothe their own unmet longing. Because it's easier to care for others than to admit that no one ever truly cared for you. It's more comfortable to appear strong than to confess that inside there are days when you feel incredibly small. And the cruelest part is that the world rewards this behavior. It calls it maturity, empathy, altruism. But no one asks what this person is losing in the process. No one sees that behind every generous act, there might be a wound silently crying for help. Because when helping becomes a necessity, not a choice, something flips. The other person stops being the goal and becomes the means through which this person tries to feel alive, useful, valid, and that is exhausting. Over time, they don't even realize they're running on empty, that they're only remembered when someone needs something, that they're only called in times of crisis, that most of the relationships they maintain are one-sided. And when, for whatever reason, they try to reverse the dynamic, when they show vulnerability, when they need comfort, when they say, "I can't handle it today," the world recoils. Some people pull away, others go silent, and once again, they learn that their pain is inconvenient, that their sadness doesn't belong in the spaces where they were once so welcomed as the caretaker. So the cycle begins again. They go back to smiling, back to saying, "I'm fine," back to giving, even while in pieces, because they believe it's the only way to be accepted, because deep down they're terrified of losing all their worth if they're not someone else's solution. But living this way is dying slowly. It's fading away in the name of a kind of acceptance that never truly fills the void. Because no love built solely on function can nourish the soul. It takes courage to break that cycle, to recognize that the need to help might, in fact, be trying to cover inner wounds. That loving others is beautiful, but it can't be an excuse to keep neglecting yourself. That caring for the world can't be used as a crutch to hide your own self-abandonment. And that sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer is putting yourself first, not out of selfishness, but because no one can give what they've never fully received, and you too deserve to be cared for, even if no one ever taught you how. There's a moment that may seem simple to those on the outside, but for some people it's deeply terrifying. The moment someone truly sees them, not the image they project, not the role they've taken on, but the whole person, with cracks, messiness, contradictions, exhaustion. When someone looks at you with calm, sincere affection, without expectations, without rush, and you realize there's nowhere left to hide. You can't control what the other person sees. And for someone who's spent their life being strong, functional, and caring for others, that feels like a threat, because being seen also means becoming vulnerable. Most of us learned to love through layers, to show only the good side, to hide the chaos, to mask the insecurity. But when someone looks deeply into us with tenderness, all those layers start to weaken. The mask begins to slip, and suddenly we find ourselves trying to sabotage that gaze, making jokes, changing the subject, downplaying our importance. Because the discomfort of being fully seen is almost unbearable when you haven't fully accepted yourself yet. It's like saying, "If you really see me, you'll be disappointed, you'll leave me, you'll realize I'm not as good as I seem." That reaction isn't overthinking, it's reflex, a reflex born from a story where affection was conditional, presence was transactional, and love always came with strings attached. When someone appears and loves you without asking you to edit yourself, something inside begins to collapse, because it doesn't know how to deal with that, because it never learned that you can be enough even when you're scared, even when you're unsure, even when you're not at your best. And then survival instinct takes over. The mind starts to test, to push away, to doubt, not out of malice, but out of protection. Often the fear of being seen is stronger than the desire to be loved, because being seen means someone might touch the very wound you've spent your life trying to hide. And what if they're not kind? What if they laugh? What if they leave? What if they confirm all the things you silently believe about yourself? So it feels safer to keep your distance, to control the narrative, to keep being the one who helps, who listens, who takes care, because that role is safe. In that place, you'll never be rejected, never be abandoned, because you were never truly revealed. But living that way is only half living. It's loving with fear. It's being surrounded and still feeling alone, because what truly connects us isn't the idealized version of who we are. It's the courage to show up whole. And yes, it's scary. Yes, it's risky. But that's where real affection lives. The kind of love that isn't based on worthiness, but on presence. The kind of love that doesn't expect perfection, but offers shelter even when you're falling apart. To accept that kind of love, you have to stop running from the mirror. Face your own shadows with compassion. Accept that no human being is made of light alone. And from there, allow the other person to see you too. Because someone who truly loves you doesn't get scared by your backstage. And if they do, maybe it's not love. Because someone who loves stays, even after seeing, even after knowing the chaos, even after realizing that behind the armor there's a tired heart, just wanting for once to be nothing more than itself. When we spend too much time believing we only matter if we're perfect, if we're useful, if we're the strongest in the room, affection becomes suspicious, kindness becomes a riddle, love, when it arrives, feels like a miscalculation. Is this person really seeing me right? That's what echoes inside someone with a wounded self-image. Because when you're used to seeing yourself as not enough, flawed, broken, you start doubting anyone who says otherwise. It doesn't matter how much sincerity exists in the other's gaze. If inside you still carry the shame of being who you are, love will feel like an exaggeration or a lie. This distorted self-image doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's built drop by drop, in childhood, in adolescence, in relationships that offered not comfort, but constant demands. It comes from parents who only praised results, friends who only reached out when they needed something, lovers who only wanted you while you performed. Over time, the gaze of others became a threat, and you got used to observing yourself through a magnifying glass of flaws. The parts of your body you hate, the traits in your personality you find unbearable, the moments you failed to be what others expected. All of this slowly formed a hardened, guilt-ridden, self-critical inner image. One so rigid that any attempt at love that sees you differently feels uncomfortable, almost painful. That's why when someone says they think you're amazing, you laugh. When someone praises your intelligence, you answer with irony. When someone says they like being around you, you ask why. Because your mind doesn't understand, because your self-image doesn't match reality. And anything that doesn't align with your internal narrative of unworthiness is seen as exaggeration, delusion, or the other person's neediness, as if the mistake is always in them, never in you. If they love me, it's because they haven't seen everything yet. If they're being kind, it's because they don't really know me. And in doing so, unconsciously, you push love away. You test it, you provoke it, you sabotage it. This distorted self-image makes you believe the love you receive is more about the other person's loneliness than your own worth. As if affection were an emotional accident, not a legitimate reflection of who you are. And the worst part is that it keeps you from building deep connections. Because you never truly believe the other person is there by choice. You always think it's by mistake, illusion, or their own need. And that steals your peace. It steals the good moments. It steals the ease of simply being and letting yourself be loved. But the image you have of yourself is not absolute truth. It's a construction. It was shaped by experiences that often didn't reflect who you truly were. You weren't less worthy of love because you made mistakes, cried, or failed. You weren't weak for feeling afraid. You weren't inadequate for needing affection and not receiving it. Those who didn't know how to love you weren't mirrors. They were limits. And what they failed to see is not your fault. It is possible to rebuild that image, but it doesn't happen overnight. Healing begins when you stop fighting the love you receive. When, even through the shame, you try to hold the gaze of someone saying, "I like you." When, even doubting, you allow the compliment to stay a second longer before dismissing it. When, little by little, you replace the question, "Why do you love me?" with a simple, "Thank you for loving me." Because maybe the love you receive isn't exaggerated. Maybe you just learned to see yourself as far too small, and now it's time to reconfigure that mirror. To let the gaze of others slowly help you remember what pain made you forget. That you are, in fact, someone who can be loved, even in the parts of yourself you haven't yet learned to love. Some people say they want a peaceful love. They dream of someone who welcomes, understands, stays. But when that kind of love shows up, When someone actually arrives who doesn't yell, doesn't play games, doesn't walk away at the first sign of conflict, that same person feels uncomfortable. They feel bored. They miss the butterflies, the urgency, the kind of passion that hurts. Because deep down, what they learned to call love wasn't peace. It was anxiety. It was instability. It was the constant adrenaline of having to win someone over again and again. And when the bond doesn't demand a fight, they find it strange. Because calm feels like absence. Because steady affection feels dull. Because what's safe feels fake. That resistance isn't overreaction. It's trauma. It's the result of an emotional history where love was unpredictable, unstable, conditional. People who grew up having to earn affection, who only received attention when something was wrong, who never knew what to expect from those who claimed to love them. In these stories, affection gets tangled with tension, with constant vigilance, with a permanent sense that something is about to go wrong. And when love arrives clean, gentle, without demands, the body reads it as strange, as if it's saying, if everything seems too fine, something must be hidden. Someone's going to cheat, someone's going to get tired, someone's going to disappear. That's why calm love leads to sabotage. The person starts poking, testing, pulling away. They invent problems, raise doubts, build walls. And when questioned, they say they're just protecting themselves. And in a way, they are. They're trying to protect themselves from the possibility of being happy and then losing it. Because the pain of abandonment is familiar, but the pain of losing something that finally felt good, that pain is unbearable. So it's easier to end it now. It's easier to pull away before it becomes essential. It feels safer to keep your distance than to become emotionally dependent on someone who might leave. But true love doesn't rush. It walks. It doesn't invade. It waits. And for someone used to intense relationships, that feels like disinterest, like a lack of passion. But in truth, it's respect. It's maturity. It's a conscious choice. It's someone saying, I'm staying, even when it's hard, even when you doubt everything, even when you try to push me away. And that's terrifying, because no one's ever stayed before. No one has ever been steady enough not to make you earn it. Healing begins when you realize you no longer need to get hurt to feel alive. That love doesn't have to hurt to be real. That peace isn't boring. It's relief. That steady affection isn't lack of emotion. It's emotional safety. And that you don't have to live in a state of alert to keep someone close. True love doesn't demand a show. It finds joy in the silence, in the gentle touch, in eye contact, in the soft whisper of stay. Unlearning anxious love and relearning serene love is one of the greatest emotional challenges a person can face, because it requires letting go of the adrenaline to allow yourself comfort. It requires quieting the mind, to hear the body say, this is safe. And when that day comes, the day you no longer run from someone who loves you gently, maybe then you'll understand that the deepest kind of love is the one that doesn't trap you. It's the one that lets you rest. There's an emotional trap that looks a lot like generosity, but deep down it's just a disguised way of seeking acceptance, the addiction to being needed, the silent compulsion to always be available, to solve problems, to anticipate needs, to be everyone's unconditional support. Not because it feels light, but because it creates a sense of worth. Because for many people, the idea of being loved simply for who they are was never enough. So love becomes something earned through usefulness, and when you're not doing something for someone, the emptiness creeps in. The question arises, do they still want me around? This behavior, although it may appear altruistic, is actually a form of dependence, a subtle emotional dependency that doesn't show up as obvious neediness, but as the constant urge to be helping, to have a role, to feel that if you weren't there, everything would fall apart. And that becomes a dangerous fuel, because every time someone says, I don't know what I'd do without you, there's a moment of relief, a reinforcement that your presence has purpose. But with that relief comes a burden, because now you have to maintain that image. You can't fail. You can't disappear. You can't say no. Over time, this becomes your identity. You stop existing as a person and start existing as support, and any sign that the other person is fine without your help is read as abandonment, as if love were fading, as if their independence proved that you're no longer essential. And being dispensable, for someone who only learned to feel loved when they were useful, is terrifying. That's why, even unconsciously, This person may start entering unbalanced relationships, where they're always more the caretaker than the cared for, more available than embraced, more solution than human. This cycle is draining, because no matter how much others admire your strength, no matter how much they value your presence, no one can truly love someone who never shows up fully, and someone who's always serving doesn't find space to be served. Someone who's always listening isn't heard. Someone who's always strong isn't allowed to fall, until one day the body screams, the soul demands, burnout arrives, and everything that once looked beautiful, altruistic, essential, becomes exhaustion, becomes resentment, becomes invisibility. Breaking this addiction is hard, because it means accepting that you can be loved even without saving anyone, that you can be cherished even when you're not fixing anything, that you can show up without having to be indispensable. Because true presence doesn't require a function, it requires connection, and real connection only grows when you have the courage to exist beyond your usefulness. When you can be with someone without constantly needing to prove you deserve to be there. Being needed feels good, but being loved without needing to be needed is freedom. It's the kind of love that doesn't turn you into a tool, but into a person. A love that doesn't demand from you, but chooses you. A love that says, you don't have to save me. You just have to be you. There are people who, even surrounded by friends, family, and others saying you can count on me, still can't ask for help. Not out of pride, not out of arrogance, but out of guilt. A deep, quiet guilt that whispers, you're a burden. You're going to be too much. You're going to disappoint the people who see you as strong. And that guilt comes from a lifetime spent trying not to be a problem for anyone. From a childhood where crying was called drama, needing something was seen as weakness, and depending on someone meant being ignored, or worse, punished. So this person learned to manage alone, to swallow their tears, to comfort themselves in silence. And over time, asking for help became almost forbidden. They even think about sending a message. They rehearse the phone call, but they freeze. They think the other person is too busy, that they already have enough problems, that they'll think it's an overreaction. So they postpone it and solve things alone, again, even when they're falling apart, even when they can barely get out of bed, even when all they truly want is to hear someone say, I'm here. Because in their mind, asking for help is opening the door to rejection. It's exposing vulnerability. It's risking showing they're not okay and not being met with care. And that would be devastating. That's why so often this person gives so much, listens so deeply, is always present. Because unconsciously they hope it will build a bridge, that one day someone will notice their pain without them having to say a word, that someone will say, you look tired, without them having to fall apart, that someone will hug them before they even have to ask. But real life doesn't work like that. People can't read minds, and someone who never shows their wounds is often seen as someone who doesn't have any. And little by little, this person drifts further away, not by choice, but because they don't know how to ask for comfort without feeling like they're breaking an internal rule, that love is given, not asked for. And when they finally do try, when they say they're not okay, that they need support, that they can't handle things, often the response is disappointing. A that sucks, or a you'll be fine, or a you're strong, you'll get through it. And that confirms the fear. I knew it wouldn't help. So they shut down again. Harden up. Swear to themselves that they'll never rely on anyone again. But inside, they still long for it. Because everyone needs to be cared for. Everyone needs comfort. Denying that need isn't strength. It's emotional survival. A way to avoid more disappointment. Unlearning this guilt is a process. It involves understanding that being human means needing others. That asking for help isn't weakness, it's honesty. That the people who truly love you will feel honored to be there when you're not okay. And that asking for comfort doesn't make you less valuable. On the contrary, it brings people closer. It builds real bonds, it softens pride, it opens the door to true reciprocity. You don't have to carry everything alone, you weren't made for that. Your pain is no less valid just because you're strong. Your sadness is no less real just because you're aware of it. You are allowed to ask for help, and if it doesn't come from where you expected, that says more about them than about you. But it doesn't mean the whole world will abandon you. There will always be someone who knows how to listen, someone who understands the weight of silence, someone who will hold you without trying to fix you, and that person will often only appear when you finally have the courage to say, "I need help." Sometimes love arrives the right way. Calm, sincere, ready. A kind of love that looks you in the eyes, listens without rushing, stays even when you don't know what to say. But inside, something stirs. Part of you wants to surrender, wants to trust, wants to open your arms. But another part, older, more frightened, starts building walls. And you don't even notice, but you begin to sabotage. You make jokes in the most tender moments. You downplay the beautiful gestures. You create conflicts where there are none. You respond with coldness to things that deserve warmth, and in the end the other person pulls away, not because they wanted to, but because they were pushed, and everything you feared most happens. You're left alone. Again. This pattern doesn't come from nowhere. It's rooted in old stories where love used to hurt, where trusting meant opening your chest to abandonment, where every connection came with a break, where being vulnerable was dangerous. So now, even when the situation is different, even when the affection is genuine, your emotional system sounds the alarm. This will go wrong. It's too good to be true. Once I get attached, they'll disappear. And to avoid the pain of loss, you preemptively break things off. You sabotage before it can hurt. You create a reason not to dive in. But deep down, you're suffering even more. The irony is that you long, with all your heart, to experience true love, to be embraced, to be seen, to be held in your flaws. But when that love approaches, your mind says it's not safe, that it's not for you, that they'll get tired, that they'll discover your worst and run away. So, without realizing, you put the love to the test. You become distant. You push boundaries. You make the other person question their own feelings. And when they grow tired, you say, "See, I knew it." But it wasn't inevitable. It was fear. It was old pain trying to protect you from suffering, and in the process keeping you from living. Recognizing this cycle is painful, but it's also freeing, because only when you admit that you're afraid of being loved can you begin to love for real. To love without armor, without the need for control, without the obsession to keep everything under surveillance. And that takes practice. It means learning to breathe when the urge to run appears. It means allowing someone to come close even when every part of you wants to flee. It means accepting that real love doesn't come to invade. It comes to meet you. You have the right to be loved, even with all your flaws, even with all your traumas, even with all your defense mechanisms. And the love that's truly worth it won't give up easily, but it also won't survive being endlessly rejected, because no one can offer affection forever without reciprocity. Love isn't just about wanting. It's about allowing. And allowing sometimes is the hardest act for someone who's spent a lifetime being the first to leave. So if love arrives, and you feel the urge to run, breathe, wait a little before reacting. Ask yourself whether the danger is real or just a memory. And if it's just a memory, hold the hand. Stay a little longer. Because maybe this time you don't have to protect yourself. Maybe this time you can simply let yourself be loved. It's a strange paradox. You spent so long longing for true love, someone who would stay, who would see you, who would embrace you, and now that this person exists, all you feel is irritation, a nearly childish discomfort with how well they treat you, a strange unease in response to their patience, their gentleness, their care, and then, without really knowing why, you find yourself being short, cold, impatient, throwing emotional tantrums, creating distance, and afterward, you feel guilty. You ask yourself what's wrong with you. But maybe the question isn't, why do I react like this? But instead, why does love irritate me so much when it's finally good for me? The answer almost always lies in the wounds, in the emotional scars left by painful relationships, by people who confused care with control, by bonds where affection always came with strings attached, with absence, with guilt, with manipulation. So when someone suddenly treats you differently, authentically, your system crashes, because it doesn't match the script you memorized. Constant affection doesn't make sense. Attentive listening feels fake. Love without chaos seems boring. And deep down, the anger isn't toward the person. The anger is toward the feeling of being fully seen, and more than that, of being loved anyway. That kind of love confronts all the distorted versions of yourself you've built over the years. It forces you to face the question, what if I really am worthy of all this? And that question, though beautiful, can be unbearable for someone who grew up feeling inadequate, because if you accept that you deserve this kind of love, you also have to accept that you spent too long believing the opposite. You have to face the pain of all the times you were mistreated and thought you deserved it. You have to confront the uncomfortable truth that maybe you normalized bad relationships because you thought that was the best you could get. So the anger becomes a defense. Because it's easier to feel irritated than emotional. It's more comfortable to push away than to surrender. It's simpler to sabotage than to relearn how to love. True love demands a kind of emotional maturity you may not feel ready to give, not because you don't want to, but because you've never seen love like this before. You've never experienced a bond where you didn't have to prove yourself, where you could just exist without fear, where you could mess up and still be held. The anger is just the surface. Beneath it, there's fear, there's pain, there's a scared heart trying to understand why something so good is happening to it, and above all trying to believe that this won't just vanish, that it's not just a phase, that it's not just an illusion, that this time it could be real. And yes, it can. But for that to happen, you need to make peace with the possibility of being loved without having to defend yourself. You need to understand that the affection that irritates you today might be the same one that heals you tomorrow. Love isn't just about making room for someone else to enter. It's about making room inside yourself to accept that you, exactly as you are, with all your reactions, confusion, and blocks, are still someone deeply worthy of love. And that true love doesn't want to change you. It just wants to stay. Receiving love is not passive. It's a deeply active act, almost revolutionary, especially for those who have spent their whole lives being the one who gives, who holds, who's always available. Allowing yourself to be cared for requires more courage than caring. Allowing yourself to be touched, praised, supported takes more strength than keeping everything under control. Because for someone who only ever learned to be love for others, becoming the target of love feels dangerous. It feels like a loss of autonomy, like exposure, and worse, like selfishness. Because deep inside, that old voice still echoes, "You don't need this. You can handle it on your own. Don't be a burden." But the truth is, no one was born to be emotionally self-sufficient. That was a defense, an armor, a survival mechanism. You learned not to expect anything from anyone so you wouldn't get disappointed. You learned not to crave affection so you wouldn't feel its absence. You became the strong one, the reliable one, the structured one, because you sensed that if you fell apart, no one would come pick up the pieces. And now when someone finally comes close and offers everything you never had, consistent affection, real listening, a loving presence, the discomfort is inevitable. Not because you don't want it, but because you've never known how to accept it. Learning to receive starts with small gestures. It starts when, in response to a sincere compliment, you decide not to brush it off with sarcasm. When someone offers help and you don't say, "It's fine, I've got it." When you're feeling low and instead of withdrawing, you choose to say, "Can you stay with me for a while?" It seems simple, but it's not. It's hard. It means exposing a part of yourself you once swore never to let be vulnerable again. It means saying to the world, "I need too." And for someone who survived by being needed, being wanted, with no task, no function, no effort, can feel unreal. But that's where real love lives. The kind that doesn't demand you, doesn't measure you, doesn't turn you into a project. The love that just wants to love you. And accepting that love is a process. Because at first everything in you will scream that it's too much, that it's fake, that it's temporary. But little by little, if you persist, something shifts. The mind begins to quiet, the body begins to relax, and you realize that being loved doesn't diminish you. It doesn't make you weak. On the contrary, it returns you to your full, human, whole, imperfect, and valid self. You have the right to be cared for, to be hugged when you're low, to be listened to even when you have nothing useful to say, to be loved even when you're not at your best. And allowing yourself that is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's part of what heals, because the affection you give so naturally to others also deserves to land on you. And you don't have to do anything but make space, breathe, receive, and let it stay. Receiving love is perhaps the most intimate act a person can experience. It's trusting that someone will see your flaws and still choose to stay, and that trust cannot be forced. It's built. One gesture at a time, one moment of kindness at a time, one silent, yes, I accept each time you feel you don't need to run. Because in the end, love doesn't want to invade. It wants to enter gently, sit beside you and stay there. Just stay. There is a pain that has no name, yet it pulses deeply inside. The pain of never having been cared for the way you needed. Of facing things far too big at an age far too small. Of crying in secret because no one would notice. Of being strong when all you really wanted was to be held. And this pain doesn't scream. It whispers. It whispers in every relationship where you feel you can't trust. In every moment of vulnerability that you hide. In every time someone loves you and you don't know what to do with it. Because the affection that was missing shaped your entire world. And the cruelest part is that when you grow up without care, you get used to living without it. You learn not to ask, not to expect, to figure things out on your own. But deep down, there's always been a child waiting. Waiting for the gaze that holds you without rushing, for the hand that soothes without demands, for the voice that says, I'm here, you don't need to explain. And that child never disappeared. It only learned how to wear a mask, to perform competence, to become an adult before it was time. And when, in adulthood, you realize that care never came, not even when you needed it most, a mourning begins. A mourning for something that never happened, for something you deserved but didn't receive, for a presence that should have been a right but became an absence. And living through this grief is disorienting because the world doesn't recognize it. No one holds a funeral for what was missing, but inside you there's pain, and it's valid. And it needs to be seen, felt, respected. Because while this grief remains unprocessed, you'll keep trying to make up for the past in the present. You'll keep waiting for someone to finally come and do what no one ever did. And no relationship will feel light, because it will carry unconscious expectations, old thirst, a need for repair. Allowing yourself to mourn is an act of liberation. It's looking at yourself with compassion and saying, you weren't dramatic, you were a child needing love. It's allowing yourself to cry for what never was, for everything you had to swallow, hide, ignore just to belong. It's recognizing that there was abandonment, even if it wasn't intentional, and that abandonment left marks. Marks that now show up as fear of intimacy, difficulty trusting, the constant exhaustion of someone always trying to prove their worth. But grief, when lived honestly, transforms. It doesn't erase what was missing, but it makes room for you to choose what you want to build from now on. It opens space for you to learn how to care for yourself, to offer yourself the kindness you never received, to look at yourself with the tenderness you always hoped to find in someone else. And most importantly, it creates space for you to accept care from others without the guilt of feeling like you're asking for too much. You can't change what was missing. You can't rewrite your childhood, but you can now begin to build an inner space where care is possible, where love is welcome, where affection no longer needs to be earned, only received. And maybe, in that process, you'll discover that what was missing doesn't have to define you anymore. It can remain part of your story, but it doesn't need to be the end of it, because now you can offer yourself what the past denied you, and slowly allow others to do the same. There's a quiet belief that love is natural, instinctive, that it just flows, but for those shaped by abandonment, by relentless demands, by the denial of affection, being loved becomes unfamiliar territory. Wanting it isn't enough. You have to learn. Learn to stay when all you want is to run. Learn to breathe when care arrives. Learn not to deflect a compliment with sarcasm. Learn not to retreat when someone says, "You matter to me." Because for someone who has spent their whole life only giving love, being loved isn't passive. It's a daily practice, a constant exercise in tolerating the discomfort of goodness. And in the beginning, it's hard. Love that expects nothing in return feels fake. Selfless care feels suspicious. Free affection feels like pity. And the instinct is to push it away, to test it, to create chaos, because the silence of peace is deafening for someone who only ever knew love through tension. But that's where the exercise begins, to keep your heart open even when afraid, to not sabotage the bonds that finally feel healthy, to accept that yes, you can be loved, without having to suffer first. This practice happens in small and yet monumental gestures, like not apologizing for crying, like saying I need you without shame, like accepting a gift without immediately thinking of what to give back, like believing that someone can genuinely choose you without needing you to perform perfection. And slowly, these gestures build muscle, and that muscle sustains the idea that maybe love isn't a battlefield, maybe it's a place to rest. But like all practices, there will be setbacks, days when you doubt, when you want to disappear, when you think you're unworthy, that it'll all go wrong, that the other person will get tired. And that's okay. Because if self-love is a practice, then being loved is too, and no one gets it right all the time. What matters is continuing to try, continuing to stay, continuing to tell yourself, I can receive this, because love doesn't exist in the absence of fear. It's built on the choice to stay, despite it. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. You don't have to always be strong. You don't have to have all the answers. Real love isn't interested in your performance. It's interested in your presence. It doesn't want you to be invincible. It just wants you to be available. And being available, in this context, means allowing yourself to be seen, to be cared for, to be important to someone. At the end of the day, the love you always longed for was never the kind that applauded you from afar. It was the kind that sat beside you in the dark, that held you on days you didn't even like yourself. That said, I'm staying even when you didn't believe you deserved it. And that love, you can have. But for that to happen, you need to stop running, stop testing, stop doubting. And above all, you need to accept that, yes, being loved is a part of you too, one that is finally ready to exist.